Hoon on the kaka to Barbara Edmonds, who is Labour's finance spokesperson and also the MP for Mana in Wellington. Great to have you on the show, Barbara.
Yeah, talofa whenua, thanks for having me on.
Now, we've had some inflation figures in the last couple of days. 2.7% annual inflation versus 2.5% in the March quarter, so up, but not as much as what some market expectations were. What did you think of those inflation figures?
When you look at the figures, they're still the highest level they've been in a year. And if you look at what's causing the increases or the big elements of that inflationary figure, it's food, electricity, and housing costs. The Prime Minister Christopher Luxon and the National Party, they were elected on the promise to make the cost of living better. Instead, what we're seeing is actually it's worse. The difficult part, though, is in particular for families. It's those inflationary pressures, for example, across electricity prices and food, which are things that they can't avoid. Those are the things that they need, every day. So it is a concern.
So the government has said, well, there's not much we can do about this. These are international prices. We can't change the price of butter or, veggies. It's the weather, it's international prices, it's diesel prices, whatever. So what do you say back? Because, when you were in government, you said some similar things.
Yeah, well, exactly. And we got penalised for the fact that we were recovering from a pandemic. Fuel prices or oil prices at the time were really high because of geopolitical, circumstances with Russia versus Ukraine. So again, it's quite. I find it quite cynical that the government is blaming international prices when at the same time when we were saying there were international prices, because the tradable inflation coming into the country was high. I just find it quite a cynical argument from the government, and we've been pressuring them a bit in the House or in Parliament in relation to their position, which all of a sudden was, weather events do affect food prices. What happens overseas does affect tradable inflation. So there's an element of cynicism for me, but in particular because they promised that things would get better under their watch.
Yeah, you can sort of understand the international prices and the weather, but there are some administered prices in the CPI. So government fees and charges, electricity prices, and there's a bunch of elements in there, lines charges plus the retail electricity cost. And then you've got council rates. What's your view on the government's role in those administered types of inflation?
So the interesting element around those local authority rates, they're captured in the September quarter from 2024. So it's no surprise that rates were in double figures. There's a reason why we brought in changes to, work around water infrastructure. The government, one of the first things that they did in their 100 days was to repeal that action. And then we've spent the last 18 months trying to bringing in legislation to do water services and infrastructure. We've been saying for a long time that we know water infrastructure is a big reason why rates were going to increase, which is why we had our own policy in hand. The government's sitting on their hands or, trying to get through their program 18 months later is a direct correlation with why you see a double-digit rate increase from last year.
Yeah, because the whole problem here is that the government doesn't want to borrow in its own right to pay for the infrastructure that councils will have to build to deal with all the population growth, let alone the undone maintenance and the lack of infrastructure to deal with that population growth. So the government's ruled out we're not going to use our balance sheet, essentially forcing the councils to use their balance sheets. And most of them have pretty good credit ratings, and they're able to, in theory, create these standalone bodies, which actually are remarkably similar to Three Waters type bodies. But that aside, the government argues it's better that we don't use our balance sheet and borrow more, because if we borrow less relative to the base case, then that means that interest rates can stay lower. There'll be less pressure on the economy and on inflation, and therefore people are better off because inflation is lower than it otherwise would be, and mortgage rates would be lower than they otherwise would be. Do you think that's true?
And how's that working out? You know, like really, how's that working out? Yes, it's off the government balance sheet, but actually council authority rates local authority rates have gone up by double digits, because it doesn't matter whether it's on the government balance sheet, it's going to be on the council balance sheet. And guess who funds that? That's ratepayers. So there's still that element of non-tradable inflation because of those rate increases that sit with the ratepayer, who's effectively a taxpayer, and it's still something that is taken into consideration by the Reserve Bank when making those OCR, those monetary policy decisions. So it doesn't matter how much the government pushes the cost onto the taxpayer or the ratepayer. For example, sure, the balance sheet looks better because they're not subsidising under 25-year-old free public transport, but that cost still goes on to the parents who will need to pay higher public transport fees. So the cost is still there. It's just the government saying, well, it's not our balance sheet. But that's not how good governance works. We knew there was an issue because of the lack of investment in water infrastructure. We had a policy in place, you know, as you said, with Three Waters. The government repealed it. They've taken 18 months to get to the point where they're now at the third bill of that water services bill, and that 18 months has still led to a 12.2% on average, increase on local authority rates as captured in September last year. So,
now, other parts of the inflation story are around supermarkets, electricity with the big four gentailers, food. We've got a few monopolists in there. I think dairy, is pretty dominated by Fonterra, and you've got the two supermarket chains. So we've got large chunks of the economy that have already been investigated for not being competitive enough, let alone regulated or changed. But there were critics of Labor when it was in power too, that it didn't do enough to make these markets more competitive. Take the tough actions. The government's talking a good game. Do you think they'll be able to take some of the inflation pressure that's coming actually from increasing profit margins and not enough competition?
Talking a good game is different from actually the action for it and actually putting your words into action. And we've heard a lot from the government. We've heard a lot of stomping of feet and a lot of stomping on desks saying, I'm going to pull these people in and talk to them. But actually what we're not seeing is the action that comes from that. So I appreciate and acknowledge that, Labor could always do more when we're in government. I mean, no government is perfect. But I think some of those core foundation pieces, which we did, for example, setting up the Grocery Commissioner, some of the work that the Grocery Commissioner is starting to bring to light, I think is really important. So for example, the focus around wholesale food prices. Wholesale food prices, for example, help smaller businesses, so not just the supermarket players, but the smaller businesses such as the butcher, the fishmonger, the greengrocer. That helps them being able to be more competitive against the bigger guys. So I think there's a bigger picture to look at that the government should be trying to pull on all levers. But at the moment, I've heard a lot of talk and a lot of stomping, but not actually much action yet.
So we've got
inquiry, they kicked it back to the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee to look at it, even though the Commerce Commission had done quite a deep review into it.
Just stepping back a bit, we've got a situation where international prices have come through and forced up inflation. Administered prices from the government and from what you'd argue are monopolists. The Reserve Bank is legislated as the primary responsible independent institution that is required to keep inflation between 1% and 3% over the medium term. And it's got one tool, really. It says it only has one tool for monetary policy, the official cash rate. Yet effectively it's using that one tool to try to beat down overall CPI inflation when it really can't influence with that tool international prices or administered prices. So effectively it's using that tool, a very high official cash rate, to create unemployment, to reduce wages and to reduce pressure in those parts of the economy that are responsive to interest rates. And over a long time, that's mostly been retail spending, construction and housing. Do you think that the monetary policy arrangement and tools are working in this environment where actually most of the inflation the Reserve Bank can't do anything about, and the people who pay the price for the Reserve Bank wielding that blunt tool are poorer people who lose their jobs or are having, or maybe have borrowed for a home and have to deal with high mortgage rates?
Yeah, and what was one of the very first actions that this government did when they came into government, and that was to move the maximum sustainable employment remit element for the Reserve Bank. You know, and that's why we've seen, from our perspective, large amounts of unemployment. You're also seeing, you know, a lot of people leaving New Zealand. 47,000 people have left New Zealand to go to Australia alone, and as well as you've talked about, you know, a loss of 15,000 construction sector roles. So I absolutely acknowledge your point. The areas where we're seeing more stickier inflation, which is sort of that domestic, non-tradable inflation, are elements that the Reserve Bank can't really touch, and which is why monetary policy needs friends called fiscal policy, which is why the government's sitting on their hands for over 18 months around the water services policy changes. That's why you see those double-digit increases, and that's why we've been trying to hammer the government, particularly in Parliament, in relation to their slowness and their realisation that, water services is not easy. And what about those orphan councils? You know, this stuff isn't easy, which is why Labor had to tackle it the way that we did. And the government just came in, repealed it, and decided to start from scratch. And that's why we had 12.2% in September quarter last year.
Barbara Edmonds, the spokesperson for Labor on Finance and the MP for Mana, thank you very much for being on the Hoon at the Kaka. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernard.